The great chamber of the Galactic Concordat hummed with voices from 100 different species, each one more advanced than the humans of Earth could ever imagine becoming in 10,000 years. Ambassador Threll of the Vacrian Empire stood at the central podium, his forearms gesturing with obvious distaste as holographic images floated above the assembly. Images of millions of desperate beings crowded into makeshift refugee camps on the edges of known space. The Krevenash situation has become untenable, Threll announced, his translator converting his clicks and whistles into a voice that echoed through the chamber. 6 million refugees from their civil war now drift in our space lanes, consuming resources and creating navigational hazards. Council members Athena, a being of pure energy contained within a crystalline matrix, pulsed with what her species considered thoughtful contemplation. No member world has volunteered to accept them, and I cannot fault this decision because the Krevenash are genetically inferior miners and laborers with limited intellectual capacity. Around the chamber, representatives nodded their various approximations of heads or gestured agreement through bioluminescent displays and empathic broadcasts. They will become a permanent burden on whichever civilization accepts them, added the Horth collective speaker, a creature resembling a massive mantis. Their backward culture cannot integrate with advanced societies. The debate continued for what humans would call 3 hours, but what the Concordat measured in stellar calculations and quantum fluctuations. Because time itself meant different things to different species then. Ambassador Quinn of the Shorter Alliance, a small rodent-like being who rarely spoke, cleared his throat with a sound like grinding metal. There is one solution we have not discussed, Quinn said quietly, but every being in the chamber heard him through their various sensory organs. We could send them to Earth. Silence fell across the assembly like a collapsing star. Earth, Threll repeated slowly as if tasting something foul. The human world. Precisely. Quinn continued with what might have been a smile on his whiskered face. The humans are known throughout the galaxy for their violence and territorial aggression because every report we have compiled shows they cannot even achieve peace among their own subspecies. Zephina pulsed with sudden interest. You propose we dump the refugees on a world that will eliminate them through natural human barbarism. I propose we give the refugees to a species whose nature will solve our problem. Quinn corrected, though the distinction seemed minimal to most listeners. The humans wage wars over resources, ideologies, and even arbitrary divisions of melanin content in their skin, because they are perhaps the most tribal species we have ever encountered. The Horth speaker clicked his mandibles thoughtfully. 6 million additional mouths to feed on a world already strained by overpopulation and resource scarcity. The humans will either slaughter the Krevenash outright or allow them to starve while fighting among themselves over who should bear the burden. Around the chamber, species that had spent millennia evolving past such primitive responses found themselves nodding in agreement because to their advanced minds, this seemed like simple mathematics of scarcity plus tribalism equaling inevitable violence. And when the refugees die from human cruelty, it sends a clear message to other potential refugee populations. Threll added with satisfaction that the Concordat will not waste resources on the genetically and culturally inferior. The vote was nearly unanimous because only 3 species abstained and none voted against this solution within 6 hours. Concordat ships had gathered the 6 million Krevenash refugees from various holding stations and begun the journey to Earth's solar system. The Krevenash themselves had no say in this decision because in the eyes of the Concordat, they were cargo. Rather than citizens, and cargo did not vote on its destination. Kreven's mother, Sala, held her 3 younglings close as the transport ship shuddered through faster-than-light travel because she had no idea where they were going, but anywhere seemed better than the war-torn ruins of their homeworld. Will there be food where we go? Her youngest asked in the clicking language of their people, while his scales showed the pale color of fear. "I do not know." "Little one," Sal admitted, because lying to younglings was considered the worst sin in Krevanash culture. "But we are together, and that is what matters." Around them, in the massive cargo hold, thousands of other Krevanash families huddled together in the dim lighting, because the Concordat had provided minimal life support, just enough to keep them alive during transport, but nothing approaching comfort, when the fleet finally dropped out of faster-than-light travel and entered Earth's solar system. Alarms blared across every human monitoring station from Antarctica to the International Space Station. "Sir, we have unknown vessels entering orbit," a young technician at NORD reported to her commanding officer as her hands shook over the console. "Hundreds of them, and they are massive." General Chun stared at the display showing ship signatures that dwarfed anything humanity had ever built, because Earth's most advanced spacecraft looked like children's toys compared to these vessels. "Broadcast on all frequencies." Chun ordered, "Demand identification and intent." The response came not as a dialogue, but as a one-way transmission that overrode every communication system on Earth, including personal phones, television broadcasts, and even car radios. "Humans of Earth." The translated voice of Ambassador Thrall echoed across the planet. "Your species is known to us as violent, tribal, and primitive, but even primitives can serve a purpose, because we bring you 6 million refugees from the Krevanash Civil War." Chun felt his blood run cold as he listened to the alien continue speaking with unconcealed contempt. "You wage wars over resources and differences in appearance. So you will understand these refugees as competition and burden," Thrall said, as if explaining something to a slow child. "We leave them in your care as punishment for what you are, because your violent nature will eliminate them and teach the galaxy a valuable lesson about the cost of being inferior," before anyone on Earth could respond. The Concordat ships began deploying massive transport vessels that descended through the atmosphere like falling stars in Beijing. Government officials watched in shock as 3 transport ships landed in designated zones outside the city and began disgorging thousands of reptilian beings who looked around in confusion and fear in New York. Emergency services received simultaneous calls from dozens of locations as more ships touched down in parks, open fields, and anywhere with enough space to accommodate the massive vessels in Lagos, Mumbai, Sao Paulo, Moscow, and hundreds of other cities across every continent. The same scene repeated itself as the Concordat dumped their unwanted refugees without ceremony or explanation beyond that single contemptuous broadcast. Within 2 hours, all 6 million Krevanash stood on Earth's surface, and the Concordat fleet departed without another word, because they expected they would return in a few months to find mass graves and the refugees eliminated by human cruelty. They could not have been more wrong about what would happen next, because humans had a capacity the Concordat had never bothered to study or understand: the ability to choose compassion even when cruelty seemed easier. Maria Santos stood in her small apartment in Sao Paulo when the news alert flashed across her phone screen about alien refugees landing in Park Ibirapuera, and her first thought was not fear or anger, but simply, those poor people must be terrified. She grabbed her jacket and the extra blankets from her closet, because even though Sao Paulo was warm, the news showed these reptilian beings shivering in the unfamiliar air. "Where are you going?" her teenage son Carlos asked from the couch. "To help," Maria said, simply because there was no other answer that made sense to her heart within an hour. She found herself at the park, along with hundreds of other Sao Paulo residents who had all apparently had the same thought, that beings dropped on an alien world without warning would need immediate assistance. The Krevanash huddled in family groups near the transport ships, their scales showing colors that Maria would later learn indicated fear and confusion, because their biology used chromatic shifts where humans used facial expressions. A May Young Krevanash female approached Maria cautiously, making clicking sounds. That meant nothing to the human woman. Maria smiled and held out a blanket in what she hoped was a universal gesture of offering. Because some things transcended language, and cold was cold in any species. The Krevanash female took the blanket tentatively, then wrapped it around her three small younglings, who immediately stopped shivering, and their scales shifted to slightly warmer colors around the world. Similar scenes played out in thousands of locations as humans confronted the reality of 6 million refugees who had been literally dropped into their midst in Tokyo. The government mobilized the self-defense forces not for combat, but for the largest humanitarian operation in Japanese history, because within 6 hours they had established processing centers where Krevanash could receive medical screening, temporary shelter, and food. Except the food was a problem that became apparent when Krevanash, who tried eating human provisions, became violently ill. Dr. Kenji Nakamura led a team of biologists at Tokyo University who worked through the night analyzing Krevanash biology from volunteers who allowed tissue samples and medical scans. Their digestive system cannot process most of our proteins, Kenji explained to his exhausted team as dawn broke over the city. We need to synthesize compatible nutrition, and we need to do it fast because they are starving. Similar research teams assembled in laboratories across Earth, including in places the Concordat would have considered too primitive to manage such complex biochemistry in Nairobi. Dr. Amara Okonkos collaborated with colleagues in Mumbai, Berlin, and Chicago through video conferences that ran continuously for 72 hours. Because human scientists had never worked together with such unified purpose, they shared data freely, without the usual academic competition or national security concerns. Because 6 million beings were starving, and that simple fact overrode everything else within 1 week. The first batches of Krevanash-compatible nutrition were being produced in factories that had rapidly retooled their production lines. The Concordat observers monitoring from cloaked ships in Earth's outer solar system sent reports back to the Council that made no sense to the alien leadership. The humans are not killing them, the surveillance officer reported with obvious confusion. They are feeding them and providing shelter. Ambassador Threll reviewed the data feeds showing humans across every nation, mobilizing resources to help the refugees, and he felt something. He rarely experienced doubt. Perhaps they planned to fatten them before slaughter, he suggested, but even to his own auditory organs, this sounded unconvincing. Meanwhile, on Earth, the initial emergency response was evolving into something more organized and long-term, because humans were beginning to realize these refugees were not leaving in a small town in Kansas. Mayor Jennifer Wright called a town hall meeting that packed the local high school gymnasium beyond capacity. Folks, we have 300 Krevanash families camped outside town, Jennifer said bluntly, because Kansas people appreciated direct talk. Winter is coming and tents will not cut it, so we need to decide what we are doing. An older farmer named Bill stood up with the kind of deliberate slowness that suggested his next words had been carefully considered. My barn is empty since we sold the cattle, and it has heating and running water so families can stay there until we build something proper. I can donate materials from my hardware store. Another voice called out, my construction crew will volunteer labor on weekends. Added someone else. Within an hour, the town had organized a building committee, a food coordination team, and a cultural liaison group because someone pointed out they should probably learn to communicate with their new neighbors. Similar scenes repeated in communities across Earth as humans confronted the reality that their world had just become home to 6 million new residents. But it was not all smooth cooperation, because fear and resistance existed as well in the darker corners of human response in parts of Europe. Nationalist groups protested the refugees as invaders, and security forces had to protect Krevanash housing from attacks in America. Certain media personalities railed against the alien invasion and demanded the government deport the Krevanash. even though nobody knew where they would be deported to. Yet these voices found themselves increasingly drowned out by the millions of humans who had made a different choice. A video went viral showing a Crevenash child and a human child playing together in a park in Toronto because play apparently transcended species boundaries when you were 5 years old. Another video showed Crevenash workers teaching human engineers an advanced metallurgical technique that their species had developed over millennia, because the refugees were not just receiving help, but offering their own skills in returning Melbourne. A Crevenash named Kresh, who had been a civil engineer before the war, worked with human architects to design housing that accommodated both species' needs. "Your building methods are inefficient but creative," Kresh told his human colleague David. Through the translation app that linguists had developed, combined with our understanding of force distribution, we could create structures far superior to either species builds alone. David grinned at what he chose to interpret as a compliment. "So we are primitives with good ideas?" Kresh's scales shifted to a pattern that the translation app identified as amusement. "And we are advanced beings who forgot how to improvise. So perhaps together we are something better than separate." This pattern of collaboration began emerging everywhere humans and Crevenash worked together, because it turned out that different perspectives and different evolutionary paths produced different strengths. The Concordat observers continued sending reports that grew increasingly alarmed, because Earth was not just helping the refugees survive, but actually thriving. Through the cultural and technological exchange, they have integrated Crevenash mining techniques into their asteroid prospecting operations. One report noted with disbelief, "Human and Crevenash crews are working together in space. Impossible." Zephina pulsed when she read this. Humans are too tribal to cooperate with other species. Yet the evidence was undeniable as months passed, and the initial emergency response transformed into permanent. Integration schools in Singapore began teaching both human and Crevenash children in mixed classrooms where younglings learned each other's languages and cultures. In Brazil, the first human Crevenash business partnerships formed as refugees with capital from selling precious metals they had carried from their homeworld invested in joint ventures with human entrepreneurs. Religious communities across Earth grappled with theological questions about alien souls and consciousness, but mostly concluded that beings who loved their families and mourned their dead deserved compassion regardless of their origin. 6 months after the Concordat had dumped the refugees on Earth expecting carnage and mass death, the reality was so different that Ambassador Threll wondered if the surveillance teams were sending fabricated data, but multiple independent observations confirmed the truth, that humans had not just accepted the Crevenash, but were genuinely building a shared society with them, and something else was happening that worried the Concordat even more than simple human compassion, because word was spreading across the galaxy through refugee communication networks that Earth was a safe haven. Other displaced populations were looking toward the small blue planet and wondering if they too might find sanctuary among the violent primitive humans who had somehow chosen kindness over cruelty. 18 months after the Concordat had dumped 6 million refugees on Earth, expecting disaster, young Crevenash student Thris sat in a classroom in Mumbai next to her human friend Priya, as their teacher explained the water cycle. The teacher, Mrs. Kapoor, was human, but she taught both species equally because the Mumbai school system had adapted quickly to accommodate mixed classrooms. "Can anyone tell me why water evaporates?" Mrs. Kapoor asked the class. Thris raised her scaled hand. At the same moment, Priya raised her human one, and they looked at each other and giggled because they had both been about to answer. "You say it," Priya whispered. "No, you." Thris clicked back through the small translation device. Both girls wore. Mrs. Kapoor smiled at this familiar negotiation. "Why don't you both answer together?" This small moment of childhood friendship represented something The Galactic Concordat had never anticipated that integration could happen naturally when people simply treated each other as people. But integration was not just happening in classrooms, because across Earth, Crevenash refugees were finding their place in human society through work, creativity, and mutual exchange in the mines of South Africa. Crevenash workers taught human miners techniques that their species had perfected over thousands of years of working. Underground foreman Johannes Bode watched in amazement as Crevenash supervisor Vren demonstrated a method of reading rock density through scale sensitivity that humans needed. Expensive equipment to measure. Your people can just feel where the valuable minerals are. Johannes asked with professional interest. Our scales sense vibrations at frequencies you cannot detect. Vren explained as his scales rippled with what Johannes had learned indicated concentration. We evolved in deep caverns where such sensitivity meant survival. And you are willing to share this with us? Johannes asked because he was still somewhat amazed that beings who had been dumped on Earth like garbage were now teaching humans valuable skills. Vren's scales showed the pattern for amusement. You shared your world with us when you had no obligation to do so, and you ask if we will share our knowledge. That is not a question that makes sense to Crevenash values. This pattern repeated across industries as Crevenash brought skills that complemented rather than competed with human abilities in construction. Crevenash understanding of structural integrity combined with human architectural creativity produced buildings that were both beautiful and incredibly durable. In medicine, Crevenash healers who understood energy flows in living bodies collaborated with human doctors who understood chemistry and surgery, creating new hybrid treatments that helped both species in the arts. The first human Crevenash musical collaboration premiered in Vienna to a sold-out audience because it turned out that music was indeed universal, even when the instruments and scales were alien. But integration was not without challenges and conflicts, because whenever different cultures meet, there will be misunderstandings and friction. In Detroit, a neighborhood dispute erupted when Crevenash families began night cycle activities that kept human neighbors awake because Crevenash had evolved with a different sleep pattern than humans. The neighborhood association called a meeting that started tense but ended with a compromise. The Crevenash would use soundproofing materials, and the humans would be more understanding that different biology meant different needs. We are not trying to be bad neighbors, Crevenash representative Sala explained through her translator while her scale showed embarrassment colors. We did not know our activities disturbed you, and we should have talked to you first instead of complaining, admitted Mrs. Chun, who lived next door. We are all still learning how to live together. This became the pattern for resolving conflicts. Conversation rather than violence. Compromise rather than domination. The Concordat observers watching this found it incomprehensible because, in their experience, integration of different species required strict hierarchy and rigid rules about who was superior. Yet humans and Crevenash were somehow managing through messy democracy and endless dialogue that the Concordat considered inefficient, but that actually seemed to work. Meanwhile, in Geneva, the United Nations established a new department specifically for interspecies relations because it was becoming clear that Earth needed formal structures to manage this new reality. Ambassador Chen Wei, who had been at NORAD when the Concordat ships first arrived, now headed this department and found himself negotiating issues he had never imagined dealing with. We need to establish citizenship protocols, Chun told the UN General Assembly, because the Crevenash are not temporary refugees anymore. They are becoming permanent residents, and many want to become citizens. The debate was heated because some nations worried about sovereignty and security, while others argued that beings who contributed to society deserved recognition eventually. A framework emerged that allowed Crevenash to apply for citizenship through existing immigration processes with some modifications for their unique circumstance. Thris mother Sala was among the first to apply for citizenship in India, where Her family had settled because Mumbai had become home in a way their war-torn original planet never could be again. I pledge loyalty to India and to Earth, Sala said during her citizenship ceremony as she held her hand over her heart in the human gesture that had been adopted for the oath. And I promised to contribute to this world that gave me and my family life when we had lost everything. The human judge who administered the oath had tears in her eyes because she understood that this moment represented something profound about what humanity was choosing to become. But not everyone on Earth was happy about integration because fear of change is also a human characteristic in parts of Eastern Europe. Nationalist political parties gained support by claiming the Krevenesh were taking jobs and resources from humans in America. Certain states passed laws restricting where Krevenesh could live or work because prejudice apparently did not require the targets to even be the same species. Yet these movements found themselves fighting against the reality that most humans had daily positive interactions with Krevenesh neighbors, co-workers and friends when a hate group in Texas attacked a Krevenesh community center. The response was not what they expected because hundreds of human neighbors formed a protective barrier around Krevenesh families. You want to hurt them, you go through us first, declared Sheriff Maria Gonzalez as she stood with her arms crossed in front of the center. And I promise that will not go well for you. The attackers retreated and were later arrested because it turned out that terrorizing refugees was still illegal, regardless of their species. Meanwhile, the Concordat was receiving reports that alarmed them far more than simple human kindness because the data showed that Earth's economy and technological capabilities were advancing rapidly through Krevenesh integration. Human spacecraft efficiency has improved by 30% using Krevenesh engineering principles. One surveillance report noted their medical treatments for previously incurable diseases have increased by combining approaches. Another added, they are developing hybrid technologies that neither species had independently. A third warned Ambassador. Thrall reviewed these reports with growing concern because the Concordat had assumed that adding 6 million refugees to Earth would weaken the humans through resource strain instead. Earth was becoming stronger, richer, and more technologically advanced through the collaboration. How is this possible? Zephina pulsed with confusion. Inferior species should not benefit from accepting genetic inferiors. Perhaps our assumptions about inferiority were incorrect, suggested Quinn quietly because he was beginning to suspect the Concordat had made a serious miscalculation. But the most alarming development came when Concordat intelligence detected something that made the entire council an emergency session refugee. Populations from other conflicts across the galaxy were beginning to flee toward Earth's solar system because word had spread through underground networks that humans would help rather than harm. We are detecting 17 separate refugee groups heading toward Earth, the security chief reported, totaling approximately 3 million beings from various species. The council chamber erupted in what each species considered agitation, because this was unacceptable. We must stop this immediately, Thrall declared. If Earth becomes a refuge for all the galaxy's unwanted populations, it will completely undermine our ability to manage inferior species. The vote was unanimous. The Concordat would intervene directly to stop Earth from accepting more refugees and to reverse what they now saw as a dangerous precedent. They would send a delegation to Earth with an ultimatum that would force the humans to reject the values they had chosen and return to what the Concordat considered proper behavior for primitives. But the Concordat had still not learned the most important thing about humans, that they were remarkably stubborn about defending what they believed was right. The Concordat flagship arrived in Earth's orbit exactly 2 years after they had dumped the Krevenesh refugees and expected to find a planet ravaged by the strain of caring for millions of unwanted aliens. Instead, their sensors detected a thriving world where human and Krevenash populations had integrated so thoroughly that heat signatures from mixed neighborhoods showed the two species living side by side in apparent harmony. Ambassador Thrall stood on the bridge of his ship staring at the data displays with something approaching rage because everything about this situation contradicted what should have happened. Broadcast our message to the human leadership, he ordered sharply. It is time to end this embarrassing experiment. Down on Earth, the emergency alert systems activated across every government as the Concordat transmission came through on all channels. Humans of Earth. Thrall's translated voice echoed across the planet. We are the Galactic Concordat, and we come with an official declaration regarding your harboring of inferior species. In the UN Security Council chamber, Ambassador Chen Wei listened with other world leaders as the alien continued speaking. You have violated the natural order by accepting refugees we designated as unworthy of Concordat protection, Thrall declared. Furthermore, we detect that additional refugee populations are fleeing toward your world, and this cannot be permitted. Secretary General Amara Okoye from Kenya sat forward in her chair as the ultimatum came. Therefore, Earth must immediately agree to the following terms. Thrall announced. 1. Reject all future refugees attempting to reach your world and turn them away by force if necessary. The chamber erupted in angry murmurs from the assembled leaders. 2. Return all Krevenash to Concordat custody for proper disposal as they remain our jurisdiction. Chun felt his hands clench into fists at the casual way this alien said, proper disposal, as if he were discussing garbage. 3. Accept economic and technological isolation from the Galactic Concordat until such time as you demonstrate proper understanding of species hierarchy. Thrall paused for effect before delivering the final point. If Earth refuses these reasonable terms, the Concordat will consider it an act of rebellion against galactic order and will respond with appropriate military intervention to protect the stability of civilized space. The transmission ended, leaving Earth's leadership staring at each other. Across the conference table in shocked silence was Secretary General Okoye, who spoke first in a voice that was quiet but carried absolute conviction. They want us to send the Krevenash back to be killed, she said flatly, and to turn away others fleeing persecution and death. If we refuse, they threaten war, pointed out the Chinese premier with concern. Then we refuse, Okoye replied simply. They have ships that make our entire military look like children's toys. The American president noted, we cannot win a conventional war against them. Perhaps not, admitted the Russian representative. But we also cannot become the kind of people who send refugees to their deaths to save ourselves. Around the table, leader after leader nodded, because regardless of their political differences, this choice was somehow clear. We need to respond, said the Brazilian president, and we need to make them understand that Earth will not be bullied into abandoning our values. The meeting continued for 6 hours as they drafted a response and planned for what might come next. Meanwhile, across Earth, news of the Concordat ultimatum spread rapidly, and humans and Krevenash alike took to the streets in massive demonstrations of solidarity in Mumbai. Thriss marched with her friend, Priya, holding signs that read, Earth stands together, in both English and Krevenash script in Snow Paulo. Maria Santos stood with her Krevenash neighbors as speakers declared that Earth would not abandon those who had become family, even in places where anti-refugee sentiment had been strong. The threat of forced deportations triggered a shift because many humans discovered that they were more upset about being told what to do by aliens than they were about living with refugees. 3 days after the ultimatum, Secretary General Okoye stood before the UN General Assembly to deliver Earth's response in a speech that would be broadcast not just across the planet but toward the Concordat fleet and out into the galaxy, to the Galactic Concordat. We say this clearly and without ambiguity. Okoye began as cameras captured her words. Earth rejects your ultimatum in its entirety. In orbit. Ambassador Thrall listened with disbelief as this primitive leader continued. The Krevenash are not cargo to be returned. They are citizens of Earth now with full rights and protections under our laws. Okoye declared, "We will not send them back to face whatever proper disposal means in your terminology. Furthermore, any refugees who reach Earth seeking sanctuary will be welcomed and evaluated according to our own standards of humanitarian law, not yours." Thrall felt his respiratory systems constrict with rage at this defiance. "You threaten us with isolation from your Concordat as if we should fear being excluded from an organization that treats sentient beings as disposable trash," Okoye said with contempt in her voice. "We do not seek membership in such a group. And finally, regarding your threat of military intervention," Okoye paused, and her next words carried steel. "Earth will defend its sovereignty and the beings under our protection with every resource we possess. We do not want war, but we will not surrender our right to choose compassion over cruelty just because you command it." The Secretary General concluded, "Earth stands with the refugees, and if that makes us rebels against your galactic order, then we are proud to be rebels." The transmission ended, and across Earth, millions of humans and Krevenash erupted in cheers. Because their world had just declared its independence from an empire they had never asked to join, but in the Concordat flagship. Thrall was already issuing orders to establish a blockade around Earth's solar system. "No refugee ships are to reach Earth," he commanded. "Intercept and redirect all vessels attempting to enter the system." Within hours, Concordat warships took up positions around the outer planets, creating a barrier that no refugee vessel could cross. The first refugee ship to encounter the blockade was a small transport carrying 300 Yilner, insectoid beings fleeing religious persecution on their homeworld. "You cannot pass." The Concordat officer informed them coldly, "Earth is quarantined, but we will die if we return." The Yilner captain pleaded Earth offered sanctuary. "That is no longer Earth's decision to make," came the reply on Earth. The detection of the blockade and the refugee ships being turned away triggered an emergency response. Ambassador Chen called together a task force that included both human military leaders and Krevenash technical experts, because he had an idea that might seem crazy, but might also be their only option. "We need to break the blockade," Chen said bluntly, "and rescue those refugee ships." Chen said bluntly. Human Admiral shook his head skeptically. "Our spacecraft are not designed for combat, and certainly not against Concordat warships, which is why we will not use conventional tactics," interjected Kresh, the Krevenash engineer who had become Earth's leading expert on alien technology. "The Krevenash know Concordat ship designs intimately because our homeworld was integrated into the Alliance before our civil war. You know their weaknesses?" Chan asked hopefully. "Every ship design has weaknesses," Kresh replied as his scales showed determined patterns. "And more importantly, my people have been working with your engineers on faster-than-light technology." This was news to most of the room because the collaboration had been kept quiet. "We have prototypes?" the Admiral asked with sudden interest. 3 vessels equipped with hybrid human Krevenash drive systems," Kresh confirmed. "They are small, fast, and use principles the Concordat will not expect because they combine our species approaches in new ways." Chung looked around the table at both human and Krevenash faces. "This is risky and could start a war we cannot win. The war started when they tried to force us to abandon people in need," replied a human general. "We are just choosing not to surrender." "When do we launch?" asked a Krevenash pilot who had trained on the new hybrid ships. John took a deep breath and made the decision. "Tomorrow at dawn." The plan was audacious almost to the point of suicide. 3 small ships would use their speed and maneuverability to slip through the Concordat blockade. reach the stranded refugee vessels, and guide them back to Earth using jump coordinates. The Concordat could not track it, required perfect timing, incredible skill, and a lot of luck, but humans and Krevenash had learned over 2 years of working together that they made a good team when combining human adaptability with Krevenash's technical precision. As the hybrid ships launched from a secret facility in Australia, their crews were mixed, human pilots working with Krevenash navigators, both species trusting each other with their lives. The fate of Earth's independence and the lives of hundreds of refugees hung in the balance as 3 small ships raced toward a confrontation with the most powerful alliance in the galaxy. And in that moment, humanity proved once again that being outmatched had never stopped them from fighting for what they believed was right.